once said, "Good leadership is rarer than a blue moon, more precious than platinum, and more lethal than weapons-grade uranium." In recent times, there has been a new wave of democratization regions of the continent. Authoritarian regimes are giving way to democratic governments. Elections have been an integral part of the democratization process, as they are an institutionalized attempt at actualizing an essence of democracy, that is, the rule of the people, by the people, and for the people. However, many of Africa's democratic elections have been marred by extreme controversy and violence, and elections are said to be central to the practice of liberal democracy all over the world. While the electoral process offers a way by which the people can freely decide who governs them, our elections are true tests of Africa's democracy. Join the conversation on today's edition of Talking Points. Stay with us. Good afternoon, distinguished ladies and gentlemen. Thank you for joining us on a fresh edition of Talking Points over your Pan-African channel for you Media Africa. Today we're discussing elections with relations to democracy across the continent, asking the question: if elections are true tests, are litmus tests of democracy across Africa. Well, a panel of guests this afternoon constitute of His Royal Majesty MUSI WAAMUWURE, who is joining us all the way here from Cameroon. Greetings to you, sir. Please, are you with us? Please, can you unmute your mic?
All right. Yeah, thank you. Thank you very much, Sharon. Thank you. And my regards to all the other panelists. It's always my pleasure being on this show.
Thank you so much for honoring the invitation. We're actually been joined, just to reiterate, you are Pan-Africanist. You are actually been joined by OPEOLUWA, TAIWO, who is the Executive Director of Africa Bridge Initiative, joining us all the way from Nigeria. Greetings to you, sir.
Yeah, good afternoon. Good to be here today. Thank you for having me all the way from Lagos, Nigeria.
It's always a pleasure having you on this edition of Talking Point. Meanwhile, like we mentioned in our preamble, we're discussing elections and democracy across the African continent. As since this year, 2024, debuted, I've seen several African countries host set elections, and most recently we saw South Africa, who held elections on May 29. Of course, the country is still awaiting the results. As we mentioned in our preamble, I'll champion this first question to you, His Royal Majesty MUSI. Now, given the context of elections across the African continent, could you make a critical analysis of the relevance of elections and democracy in the context of Africa?
Well, first, in Africa, we believe in democracy, but what we understand about democracy is the fact that democracy in Africa is a borrowed practice. It's a borrowed practice from the West, where the Westerners tend to train Africans on this particular topic, because in Africa there is usually this perception of people, of being a people's representation. And if we look at pre-colonization, how democracy started, it started from our beliefs, it started from our customs, it started from our, put it rightly, our ancestral ideologies. But when the white man came with his system of governance, they coined it using Christendom to make us Black Africans to believe that democracy does exist. This, as you would rightly understand, democracy really in its rightful context, it's a system of governance which is representative of people who are of that capacity, who are of that democratic age, as believed by the West, and who practiced and believe in what systems of governance is. And if you look at Africa, you would see that over the years, we have been practicing what the white man taught us by electing officials to represent us. And if we have a critical analysis to look at how this has been across Africa, we'll realize that most of the governments in Africa have not respected democracy until recently, when we saw what happened in Kenya. And I think we are at the verge of proving to our Africans that we are still in the process of believing if democracies truly exist. Within the context of this, within this program today, I am very certain that we are going to be looking at how this whole picture of what I have presented has impacted Africa and has brought some change, if not insignificant change, within our African leadership systems. So I think as of now, democracy is still an issue that needs a serious intervention before we can accept that we are practicing true democracy in Africa.
Absolutely, it's a call for concern. Let's recall that a few weeks ago we saw Nigeria, the country of OPEOLUWA, that actually was commemorating 1 year into the leadership of the elected president Bola Ahmed Tinubu. Now to you, Mr. OPEOLUWA, given you are the executive director of Africa Bridge Initiative, with the context of elections and democracy across the continent, how would you shed more light on these specific terms that are pertinent to the African continents, borrowing ideas from what your co-panelists said?
All right, so Africa is peculiar in terms of democracy. When we talk about democracy, what do we mean by democracy? Contextualization. The government of the people, by the people, and for the people. And what is the background, the origin of democracy? We talk about the 17th century and the 18th century, looking at the Greek state of Athens, whereby the intellectuals gather together and they make a decision from that gathering, not out of the gathering. So you can see the concept of democracy, the background of the origin of democracy. And as of today, we can be proud to say the country of Botswana is having one of the longest years, if not the longest years, in terms of what? Democracy. All right? That is uninterrupted democratic years. Now, coming back to my wonderful country, being the giant of Africa, Nigeria is celebrating 25 years of democracy, and the current President Bola Tinubu is celebrated 1 year in office as at 29th of May, just two days ago. The election that brought Mr. President, I was part of that election. Now, one thing you must understand, there are difference between election and democracy. Looking at Africa as our context of subject of discussion, democracy in Africa has not lived up to its expectation. Democracy, like I said earlier, government of the people, by the people, and for the people. So the question is, the democracy we are practicing in Nigeria, is it by the people, is it of the people, and is it for the people? No. The answer is that the government we are practicing in Africa is government of the people, by the people, and for the few, not for the generality. And that is why we are always having challenge with our electoral process. Election is supposed to lead us into a true democracy. But as of today, our election has been militarized. So that means it cannot lead us into democracy. Because democracy is a government of the people, by the people, and for the people. So since our democracy has been characterized and has been militarized, that means it will never lead us into democracy. So for us to have a true democracy, we must understand the principle of electoral process under democracy. As of today, the electoral process we have in Africa has been fully militarized, and that is not democracy. So the leaders of Africa must understand that, number one, we must come about to design the democracy of Africa. Like my colleague said, not the democracy of the Western world. We don't want the democracy of the Western world. We must have what we call customized African democracy, whereby the people can come together and decide that this will be their constitution, and they will abide by the constitution. And every leader will be subjected to the principle of that constitution. And every leader will also be subjected to the yearnings, aspiration, and the democratic demand of the people, not democratic demand of the bourgeoisie or the electoral king. The leaders must be subjected, I repeat, the leaders must be subjected to the demand, democratic demand of the people. At that level, we cannot talk about democracy of Africa.
Thank you so much, Mr. OPEOLUWA. Just to remind our televiewers and listeners that you evoked an issue of a customized African democracy across the continent, as well as a respect of constitution. We have seen several constitutional changes across the African continent, and that leads me to our next question. His Royal Majesty, given the fact that we have attested to the fact in some African countries elections are a litmus test of the nation's democracy, do you think that it's the only indicator for which a country could be termed democratic or not? Are you with us, Ms. MUSI?
I'm saying that I would take the case of Nigeria, which is one of the most recent democracies or elections that we've had in Africa that has been most talked about. If you realize what happened in Nigeria, you would see that till date, the opposition in Nigeria is still fighting and asking for true test of democracy. And I want to use this to actually level up for us to understand what has been happening across Africa. Let me ask this question, which will lead us into this conversation in another perspective. Why do we think that in Africa, whenever there is an election, and at the end of the election, when the winner is declared, there is always a contesting party,
Absolutely.
Be it the opposition. And the opposition is always contesting the elections, the result of the election. And in a situation where the opposition, like what we recently saw in Senegal, in a situation where the opposition outrightly wins the election, you will notice that the ousted or the outgone leader automatically exiles him or herself from the country, which means that we can testify without any doubt that our African leaders have skeletons in their cupboards. Skeletons in their cupboards because either they have been thievery, either they have been cheating with elections, either they have been using wrong electoral processes, either they have been using poor democratic practices, and at the point where they are disproved at any level, what happens is they have to run for their dear lives. Take it the other way around, where an opposition leader keeps contesting. I say this with few proofs, like in Cameroon, when recently President Paul Biya won the last elections, Kamto, who was the next opposition leader who had a followership, contested and even proved that he won elections. Why is it that most opposition parties in Africa are always fighting and contesting for elections? It means here that even in the words of democracy, as my friend rightly said, that it is for the people, by the people, it's quite proven across Africa that most of our leaders have not given us any reason as electorates to believe in any outcome of elections across Africa. This is the reason why you would see in most African countries, whenever there are elections, you always find a cross-section of persons. I will talk of young persons who always refuse going to the polls, registering for elections. Because take a young man like myself, I'm in my mid-40s, and I have been there since I was born, and I've seen the president of our country, Paul Biya, been in power till date. Can you imagine that for more than 40 years, I've been seeing the same person, I've been taking part in elections, I have been following up the democratic processes, and up to date, I can't testify beyond reasonable doubts that any of these elections were free and fair, following democratic principles. You're either hearing that at the polling station where elections were rightly conducted, where the opposition won elections in those polling stations, you always hear that at the end of the day, the ruling party wins. These are some of the measuring rods for us to be able to understand that there is no reason why you see most young people in Africa, there is no reason why they want to stay and to participate in elections. And like my colleague rightly said, it is important that at this moment in time, we start looking at what systems can be used by governments, by countries to leverage between how democracy should be in Africa. I'm looking at, let me take a simple example, like I'm a filmmaker and I did a short movie on democracy. And when this question was asked, what is democracy? I came back to what happens in our own normal African homes. Take a father, take a mother, take the children. You would understand that it is a pure practice of democracy because the father is the ruling party, which is the government. The mother is the opposition party. The children themselves are the electorate. They are the ones suffering from the fallouts from what the leaders are doing. So if the mother says that I want my girl child to go to school, the father is either saying that the girl child should get married, or if the father is saying that the boy children should go to school, the mother on the other hand is also saying that the boys should stay and work for the family. So I'm trying to say that if we have to allow democracy to take its rightful place in Africa, we need to sit back and look at how our parents made decisions at the level of our local condoms. I'm saying this with a lot of proof because I'm a majesty, I'm a phone, and I know exactly how practices were done in the earlier days by our ancestors, how they made decisions. And if we have to practice democracy in Africa, we have to revisit the drawing board to see exactly how our parents took some of these decisions. And I think I will share some of these testimonies as we move on this program. Thank you.
Thank you immensely, Chief MUSI. Now, to proceed with you, OPEOLUWA, you listened to your core panelists, and I recall earlier on you mentioned the need for a unified or more customized African democracy on the continent. Now, back to this, do you think, or how do you think the African continent can actualize the essence of this word democracy, or the system of democracy, one that is going to fit the context of the African continent? Borrowing from what Chief MUSI said earlier, it is supposed to be one, we need to get back to the drawing board for us to be able to understand how our forefathers managed such issues.
All right, thank you for that concise question. And I also want to appreciate my His Royal Majesty. The simple answer to the question of democracy in Africa is simply going back to the tradition. It's as easy as that. Don't go back to the drawing table, because there's nothing on the drawing table. There's nothing on the table to draw. If we go back to the table, we will continue deceiving ourselves by the ruling class. They will continue to deceive us. So where do we get the real table? The real table is with the tradition. Every community in Africa has a tradition. Every community in Africa developed a norm. Every community in Africa has a culture. So when we have that culture, according to each community, about that community develop and metamorphose through civilization to become a what? A city. So there is a process of migration from the community into the city. How come we are migrating from the community into the city, leaving behind our tradition? With democracy, we can't get it right. We are deceiving ourselves. While we are migrating from the community into the city, let's migrate with our constitution, with our what? Our tradition. The tradition supposed to be the foundation of our constitution. But as of today, the white man brought a white paper and we have what we call the constitution. The constitution was supposed to be a reflection of our tradition, of our culture. But that is not obtainable as of today. And that is what we're having every day. In every part of Africa, I saw what? White paper, white paper. And that white paper has never led us anywhere. The solution, like I've said, let's go back to our tradition. The tradition will tell us the relationship between man and woman, the relationship between father and children, the relationship between one community and another community. Let me give you, for instance, the culture, the tradition of Yoruba land is that there must be king makers and council of chiefs that will determine who should become a king. So what does that mean? It is not whether you are rich or you are poor. It does not make you a king in Yoruba land. It is the traditional what? Council and the what? The ruling king makers that will come together, not one man, because he has $1 billion in the account. And that is what has been characterizing our democracy, our election. And that's why we're not getting results. Any nation, any continent that celebrates commodity above humanity is going nowhere. So let's go back to what? To tradition. The tradition and the culture will give us a good constitution in every country, and that constitution will be the foundation of true African democracy.
Thank you so much, Mr. OPEOLUWA. We just got indications that Dr. MBIANKE LIVANCLIFF is with us. He is a Pan-Africanist and a global activist. Greetings to you, sir. Thank you for joining.
Thank you, Sharon. Greetings to you. It's always a pleasure to be here.
Thank you for honoring our invitation. Before you came, your co-panelists have been discussing today's topic of discussion with regards to if elections is a true test of democracy across the continent, and we just ended with Mr. OPEOLUWA TAIWO, who actually stated that the continent needs to get back to its tradition, and he as well mentioned, let's recall that he said that Africa needs what they call a customized African democracy. And now, as a Pan-Africanist, I recall an article published by Financial Nigeria that attested to the fact that elections do not mean democracy is flourishing in the continent. With regards to that, do you see other indicators that could, or that are indicators to the fact that democracy is meant for Africa?
When we talk about democracy, and I think my colleague Prince really iterated what democracy is all about. We talk about government who is for the people, by the people and with the people. So I think this is the real definition of democracy, where the people have the power to decide who they want, how they want it, when they want it, and also have the power to say, we don't want this person, is not working for us, we don't want this person. That is why you say that is democracy, because it puts the power back in the hands of people making the decisions. And when we look at what is happening with the elections in Africa, you cannot say that is what is being practiced. So to say elections are a test or are a display of democracy, it's untrue. It's false in the African continent, because when you look at the electoral processes in Africa, let me take for example our country, Cameroon. You realize that most of the times the ruling party is not the party wanted by the people, but because the ruling party have the authority to manipulate election decisions, to manipulate electoral processes. For example, I was so surprised. Let me tell you what is happening now. And I wanted to go and get my voter's card. And I went to a Elecam office, and a Elecam office is sending me to the police station to go and get a voter's card. And that made me not to have my voter card, because I'm like, what am I going to do at the police station? So that itself is intimidating, making a lot of people unable to even have voters card. Talk less about voting. So the ruling parties are able to influence the decisions of electoral processes, and that makes it not democracy, because the people don't have the choice to vote who they want, to choose who they want, because of that power game. I heard my co-panelist talk about traditions and going back to traditions. In as much as I really want to agree, but I have this to state. Africa itself, it's made up of diversity of cultures. In Cameroon, we have 259 ethnic groups with different cultures. There are cultures that will tell you to be a ruler, it's for life. Meaning that once a ruler comes from this family, we see that a lot in the Northwest, that is for life. So every member of that family, every male child of that family will be a ruler. Till maybe when there is no other male child, then another rule is being taken into consideration. How can you say we'll go back to traditions of any groups that are so diverse? That is going to bring a big problem, because what will work for this culture is not what will work for Yoruba, is not what will work for Igbo land, is not what will work for Hausa. Those are separate cultures. So we cannot say tradition will actually give us the solution, because it might not give the same people the power to decide what they want. What if we say, okay, let's go with the Yoruba tradition to vote our king? But that's not what the Igbo people want. That's not what the Northerners want. That is going to bring a lot of tension. So let's look for another alternative, and that is what we'll talk about: election transparency and independency. Electoral processes have to be transparent and independent of government control. For the fact that the ruling party is the one deciding who is the chairperson of Elecam, itself is a big failure. The ruling party is deciding who is the chairperson of an electoral unit. Itself is a big failure. Most 90% of those working for an electoral unit are members of the ruling party. Where is the neutrality? Where is the independence? And that is why we have electoral units that do not reflect the decisions of the people, because even those who are chairing these electoral units are influenced by the ruling party. So if we want to make electoral processes, for me, I think the electoral processes are not themselves bad, but the institutions and how they are managed have made it a way that it doesn't reflect the choice of the people. So if we are talking about rebranding, we are talking about restructuring, it's not, for me, it's not about going back to traditions, how traditions have done it, because if we say we want to retraverse back there, that system too has a lot of lapses, because we have various diverse cultures. So let's look at what we have, and that is why the electoral unit were put in place. But how they are being managed is what is being the problem, because people don't have the power. Like what happened in Nigeria. We all see what happened with Nigerian elections. The people know who their candidate was. They know. They voted for their candidate. But unfortunately, because somebody have millions and billions somewhere, can buy off the chairman of the electoral unit, a false leader was forced to the population. And this is where I asked, and I think Mr. OPEOLUWA was correct. Those white people who instituted this democracy and who said democracy has to be for the people, when they see such injustices in these electoral processes, what do they say? So at times I ask myself, the same people who bring democracy, do they even practice the democracy? Because if we're talking about democracy and we said electoral units are one arm to really advance democracy, which I believe is true, let's manage it the right way. If we see gross injustice, why are there no international units that can say no? Let's review these elections, let's review the processes, and let the people's choice be the people's choice. Once the choice fits your narrative, once the choice will work for them, once the choice will share their narratives, they allow it. So if we want true democracy, true elections in Africa, like my colleagues have said, we need to look at how our electoral processes should be managed. Independent, transparent, without any external influence. An electoral unit should be independent of government control. If we want to succeed, that's what we talk about democracy. Over to you.
Thank you, Dr. LIVANCLIFF. In a bit to stay with you so I don't forget what I'm about to say. You mentioned a very powerful point, but then how feasible is it for us or for the African continent to have independent electoral commissions, given that it is key to the success of electoral processes across Africa?
Yeah, now it's very simple, Sharon. I don't think this is rocket science, but unfortunately we have an African institution that doesn't have the mind of African people. For example, what is the role of the African Union in monitoring electoral processes in Africa? That should be, African Union starts from peace, democracy, sustainability, and socio-economic well-being of the African people. But they cannot say this is their values. Meanwhile, the people themselves do not have the chance to vote who they want to vote. So I think that is where the African Union has failed. Because if we want to say we want an independent and transparent electoral unit, meaning that the African Union should have a control, or should be the institution that set electoral units in African states, in all the member states, the 53 member states, set electoral units and have that control, make them independent from your staff, your budget, because once the election budget is coming from the Cameroon government. So once your budget, first of all, you are being financed by the ruling party, how can you go against the ruling party? So making it independent means external control, finance externally, managed externally, with experts not only from the same country, different experts, so that you cannot buy one person, and making the processes visible. And also I want to say this is another thing we can make it very independent. Digitalizing electoral processes, where as you slot in your vote in a screen, in a big screen, everybody is seeing the result. Nobody go home and is counted after. No. That alone gives a lot of room for fraud. That you throw your vote in a ballot box and you are waiting and hoping for people to count and tell you the result. That alone, that is how votes are being manipulated. But if we digitalize our electoral system, where as you cast your vote, it's showing on the screen immediately, all the nation, everybody is seeing how the votes are going, how as it is done in the US. Everybody is seeing, as people are voting, everybody, there's a big screen, everybody is following. Once votes have ended, everybody knows automatically who is the winner. That is what we are talking about, and that is what the African Union should be pushing forward, so that we know that the result and who is coming to power reflects the mind of the people, which is not everybody though, but the majority of the people. This is our choice. So I think we need to talk about external influence, external control, externally finance, and digitalization to make the electoral process transparent and independent.
Thank you, Dr. LIVANCLIFF. And a bit to proceed now with you, Chief MUSI. You listened to your co-panelist and his voice, though he evoked some challenges to electoral processes across the African continent. We should note that some African countries in recent times have enjoyed or still enjoy the fruits of democracy, like South Africa, Senegal, we mentioned Kenya, Nigeria, Botswana, like you mentioned, and a host of others. Now, looking at the up-to-date examples, which we have been stating since the start of this program, could you highlight some of the emerging challenges of electoral democracy across Africa?
Let me first appreciate my colleague, my co-panelist, for his very brilliant and elaborate input on the subject matter of our discussion today. I would like to highlight here that what he said and talked about the African Union is something that we have talked over and over on this program, and said the African Union is not a true representation of our democratic institutions in Africa, because it's been influenced by the West. I just want to take us back to the fact that when I said we should go back to our traditions and customs before we can be able to practice true democracy, it is because before the coming of independence, we had representations of our people at local levels. I'm saying so, I'm a majesty, I'm a chief, I'm a representative of my people. He made a point that you cannot be in Africa, or the different traditions that we have across Africa, for the plus or 256 ethnic groups we have in Cameroon, representation or being a leader is hereditary. Yes, that's true. I am a prince. I took over from my father, and now I'm a fawn. Yes, that's how it's practiced in Africa. But the truth is that there is this tradition that you make whenever you are identified as the head of the family. I'm taking a case of myself. I'm now the heir to the throne of my father. My father had 11 boy children who could as well had adhere to that throne. But you would notice that when you are made fond, if your father instituted or declared in his will that you will be the heir to his throne, when that happens, you as the person who comes to the throne, you have to seek approval from your brothers, from your other brothers. So I had to seek approval from my other 10 brothers to give me their support to be able to lead them as their father. And not only that, and now the villagers also, when once you get approval from your immediate siblings, you now have to now go through the identification process, where they now bring you out and show you to the entire village that this is our new fawn, and this is the person that hence will lead our people. So when I talked about us going back to the drawing board, which I meant going back to our traditional practices, I meant pre-colonization. Because before colonization came into Africa, when the white man colonized Africa, and at a certain point they gave us independence, before the coming of that independence, our forefathers still had a way of managing things and cooperating with other external villages that were their neighbors. They had a way of peace treaty. They had a way of sharing their spoils. My parents used to carry oil from Benin and go and sell in Widikum. They go to the western region and sell oil. And when they sell oil, they buy goods from those regions back to their own villages. This was an understanding. And there was this thing, the trade by barter, where if you get to the market and you have oil and you are not able to sell at the end of the day, you could give it to another woman who had Irish potato who could not sell as well, and you exchange it with oil. This was an understanding that both villages had agreed that if we have to develop, if we have to grow, if we have to continue living in peace, we have to accept to these principles and these practices. That is why I said we needed to go back to what was the norm before the coming of colonizers or before the coming of democracy. I emphasize this because our parents had a very nice way of doing things and everything was so fine. Let me also go back to what he talked about, independence and transparency. How would you even consider that a nation will have an independent and free electoral process when he rightly said that in most of Africa, those who win or those who are in power are always those who have been at the forefront? But for very few cases that you would see, which is coming up across Africa, that you see new leaders coming up who were probably very instrumental and patient opposition leaders who have made it to the top. But let me say here that in my own perspective of looking at democracy within our African context, I look at it from three standpoints. The first standpoint would be at the level of technology. I say technology because the world has become a global village where we can sit. I'm actually sitting in my office and I'm talking to you, Sharon, and my colleague is in Nigeria, is talking to us, and we can easily use this technological amenities to be able to interconnect ourselves. So we cannot talk about being one, united and indivisible across Africa as a rule for democracy without looking at technology as an instrument of that democracy. So yes, I look at technology as one of the instruments for us to practice true democracy. I look at representation. And this representation takes us back to our traditional practices, where the villagers should be able to appoint leaders and people that they believe that have their mandate, that have their backing, that they can trust, that they can believe in to sit to represent them. So this can be done within a traditional context where a people sits. He talked about many cultures. It's true. If we can have more than 40 to 50 political parties in a country like Cameroon, why can't we have more than 156 or 256 representatives from the different cultural backgrounds that we have across Africa, within Cameroon? We should be able to have every culture send in a representative whom they believe in and who will represent them at any level, at the hierarchical level, so that if there is any decision that is being taken, they are part of that decision, and they know that if their leader, whoever they appoint, fails them, they would now know that it wasn't within their competence to have won that election. So yes, I'm talking about technology, which he made it very clear. I appreciate your point that when votes are cast, those votes should be counted immediately on the screens. That's technology. And if before they cast those votes, they need to have someone sit there to represent them at the polling stations in all the 256 regions or ethnic groups that are found across Cameroon. And the last but not the least is what I call institutions. It's unfortunate that this last point that I'm raising on institutions is a little bit complicated, because look at, for example, in Cameroon, the CPDM, the ruling party in Cameroon. You would notice that the ruling party in Cameroon there are three arms of government, which are the strongest arms of every government. You have the legislature that takes the decisions, the laws of the country, and in terms of governance. You have the defense and military, which is those that use arms, they use they pressure people, they use their guns and their weaponry to impose certain things or intimidate a minority group. And this was instituted by the white man. So you have the legislature, you have the military and the defense, and then the last arm of government is finance. The ruling party always have the financial capability and financial covering to be able to sponsor their representatives at higher levels to take part in elections. So why would you think that someone who has a grip on the three strongest arms of government, legislature, defense, and finance, why would you think they will not win an election? So I'm saying here that if we have true representation of our people at every level to sit and talk on our behalf, we will realize that when they talk on our behalf and we lose or we win, because let's not also be blinded by the fact that you don't only go into democracy and expect that you have to go and win. It's a game of numbers. If you go and some other person wins you in the rightful way, you should be able to succeed the elections. So I think that to concede the election. So I think that it is but normal that when we send in our representatives and these representatives go and at the end of the day we are won, we should be ready to accept the rules or accept the outcomes of the elections and be ready to come again, because there's always another reason to say when you fall, you should be able to rise up and move on again. So if we have these three arms, the representation, technology, and good institutions, will be able to practice true democracy. I'm saying so because as a Pan-Africanist, I am tired of always coming back and throwing blames at institutions and throwing blames at governments. But I think that our governments, they need to give back power to our local authorities and let these local authorities appoint representatives who represent them at the national level. From then and from there, we can be able to put in place institutions like a LECAM, and then we only bring in international observatories to be able to look but not decide. But if we have proper representations at the grassroots, we'll be able to make meaningful decisions that will sustain our democratic beliefs and our choice of leaders. Thank you.
It's all about sustainability, Chief MUSI. Back to you, Mr. OPEOLUWA TAIWO. You listened to your co-panelists. Do you believe, or are you of the school of thought that good governance as well as bad governance stems from, say, the democratic elections we have on the continent? Mr. OPEOLUWA, are you with us?
Maybe he needs to unmute his microphone, maybe.
Please, kindly unmute your microphone. Okay, we're waiting on Mr. OPEOLUWA to get back to us. I'll direct that question to you, Dr. LIVANCLIFF. I was asking your co-panelists if, just directed to you, of course, are you of the school of thoughts that some of the consequences of our democratic elections on the continent, be good or bad, could be as a result of, say, good or bad governance systems?
Yeah, I think they are very directly linked. It's very obvious when you look at what is happening within the African continent, you realize that if you have a very poor electoral process, like His Honorable has said, His Royal Majesty has said, they translate right up to governmental management. And this thing, it's like a byway something. You cannot have a very poor electoral system and expect to have good governance, because it comes about interest. Those who are to fraud elections already shows you what interests they have. It shows you the interest is not for the people, but it's for personal interest. And you don't expect someone with such a mentality to be a ruler, and you expect that person to rule well, and you expect that person to make right decisions, and we expect good governance. No, and that has been the problem that has been killing Cameroon, for so long, because we have a very poor, I say, electoral process that has given us leaders that are not competent to manage the affairs of this nation. And Cameroonians are bleeding daily because of that. The governance is poor. The management is poor. Administratively, very poor. You have it's so disheartening. Like when you look at it, let's go right to parliamentary seats. How many, like Israel really said, are the people really actually reflected in those parliamentary seats? In those parliaments, look at the parliament sessions. I followed a lot of parliament sessions in Cameroon. Look at the parliament sessions. What is the contribution to the opposition? Where an opposition leader is given 5 minutes to talk, and a ruling party, a parliamentarian is given 1 hour. Then you ask yourself, where are we going to? Where the chair of the parliamentary session will off the mic to an opposition party and give chance but just to the ruling to the fellow colleague to talk. Then you ask yourself, well, where are we going to? If the parliament is supposed to be the unit where the people's voices are being heard, the parliament and the senate were supposed to be those units where the people, the true ideas, those reflections of the people, because we are sending in representatives. But if the same representative we are sending are not from the ruling party, their voices, our aspirations, our thoughts will not be heard in that seat. So how do we expect good governance? How do we expect it? They can only hear you if you are with them, if you toe the line. So how do we expect good governance? So these things are so directly linked. If we have failed electoral systems and processes, be rest assured that bad governance will be a consequence of those failed electoral systems.
Exactly, and we've seen a recent rise in coups across West Africa and other parts of the continent as a result of these processes, where we see military leaders come into power to take over from democratically elected presidents because of mismanagement or still bad governance systems. And now, if we're getting Mr. OPEOLUWA with us, could he kindly answer to the fact that aside the challenges to democratic elections on the continent, there are still some positive aspects that some countries still enjoy, like your country, Nigeria, and a host of others? Mr. OPEOLUWA, are you with us? Unfortunately, we are unable to connect with Mr. OPEOLUWA. TAIWO is a representative of the digital, or say, Africa Bridge Initiative, joined us all the way from Nigeria. Back to proceed with you, Chief MUSI. You listen to your co-panelists, and like I mentioned earlier, there are a lot of opportunities aside from the negative aspects of democratic elections across Africa. Could you enlighten a couple of these opportunities and how it could lead to the growth and prosperity of the economic trajectory of Africa?
Yeah, looking at the opportunities, I will talk first on the willpower, the will. The Africans have the will. As of now, there is a lot of, there's been a lot of education as to what colonization was, it is, and also the impact, the negative impact it has caused on us as Africans. So the positive aspect is that we Africans have come of age. We have received the right education. We have had wonderful experiences across the globe. We have had our own brothers and sisters who were maimed, beaten, and taken as slaves to the Western world, who have been able to find where they came from, look at their roots, go back to the ancestral ground, and take the blessings of the ancestors. We Africans have been able to study in the books and read the mistakes that our forefathers did. We Africans at every level have been able to start believing in what our people want. I'm taking the case of our military leaders. These people, they brought arms to them, they brought the gun, they brought the uniforms to them and asked them to wear these uniforms, and at any stage that any citizen wants to oppose the principles of what they stand from as governments, they can use this as a repressive measure to hush them down. our people, both in the military, both in the civic department, in the civil department, have been able to identify where our loopholes are, and they are now sitting up to the errors of the past. We have started seeing that across Africa. We have started having leaders who are young persons. Not just because they are young persons, we are having youths come into leadership because these same youths have been able to go through turmoil from the day they were born. They had people who led them till they are to the current age which they are. They have now sat up and they are taking up leadership positions, and some of them today are becoming presidents and prime ministers. So this is a pointer for Africa to understand that besides whatever challenges democracy has had on us, we, our people, have started coming to the know that it is the right time for us to sit up and go back and to be able to defend the economy and the financial power that our countries have, the resources that we have as Africans. And if we start protecting these resources, we'll be able to make the required finances that our governments, our countries, and our people want to be able to be self-sufficient. And when all of this is done, there will be no place for anyone to come in between us to pull us to the left or pull us to the right and tell us what has to be done within our democratic systems. Now, another aspect is the fact that in as much as the military is taking over command in Africa, some of these military governments have been able to organize or propose to organize elections, and because the citizens of these nations, I take a case like Burkina Faso, think that it is not the rightful time to go through democratic processes because there are fears that the West might still come in at some point to influence elections, or some of the people that are still within the systems of these leaders who have taken over power by the use of arms or by military intervention might still have people within them who might still be practicing colonization or the Western form of democracy. So the people are now giving back their powers to the leaders, the people who are taken over by coups, who are taken over by using the military, to stay in power for a period of time until they are able to build trust, not within their government, but within the people, as the people of that nation. So I think these are some of the strong points that we still have in Africa that we need to put into practice. We need to nurture to be able to build strong institutions that once we start talking about African democracy, we will be doing the right thing and not doing Western democracy, because the word democracy is just a flat word that covers the entire world, and now we are now talking about a united Africa. And if we have to talk of a united Africa, we have to build our own Africa democracy that works on trust, that has been built over the years from the time that we, the younger generation, started seeing a reason. We started seeing reason to believe in the ideologies of our current leaders who are young persons, because we have realized that the adults, the older generation who 50 years ago, 60 years ago had independence and have clinched to power, are fading away and giving rise to a new Africa. And that's the kind of Africa we're building, and those are the kind of beliefs and strong institutions that we still have in Africa, that I can assure you, as a leader of a people, there is hope that Africa can still regain its strength and become more united.
There is hope for a new Africa, and like you said, it could be built with the use of strong institutions across Africa. Back to you, Dr. LIVANCLIFF. Since we're discussing democracy across the continent, and we have mentioned that it's successful in some countries rather than others, now, do you think that democracy is applicable to every country across the African continent?
Thank you, Sharon. I think yes, democracy is very applicable. Because we talk about democracy, like His Royal Majesty said, it's just a flat word. It simply means, in a nutshell, it simply means the people have power to decide. That's what we're talking about, democracy. And I think we Africans have been practicing democracy right in our days. Just that we never call it that word, that it's called democracy today. Because giving the people the power to decide who your king is democracy. Because they have the right to choose your leader. If the people have decided that our ruler will come from one family, it's the people's choice. That's why I say it is not like there must be a change of leadership before we call it democracy. No, that's what we need to know. So democracy is simply saying the people have the power to decide what they want, how they want, who they want as leader, how they want to be governed. That's democracy. And that administration works for the people. So I think this is something that can be practiced in every African society, because it dates back even before humanity. That is why when God created mankind, God did not institute autocracy. God gave man free choice. And we are able to exercise our choice because God saw the best way of governing is democracy, giving the people the power themselves to decide how they want to be governed. So you can decide that no, I don't want to be governed by God, and you walk away. God gave you that choice. So it's to show you that humanity is to be governed by the free choice of the people. Now, the manner in which the democracy is implemented, that is what we have to look at. The manner in which this is translated, that is what we have to look at. And that is why, Sharon, I'm very happy with what my colleague Riley said. Why are we having coup d'etat in Africa? For example, in Burkina Faso, it's because the same structures that was meant to work for the people is working against the people. Absolutely. And the military saw that it is time to give back that power to the people. And I'm sorry to say this, when governments are not working for people, we don't call it coup d'etat, which is the real coup d'etat. But when the people want to take power, back the power, they call it coup d'etat, which is a misguided word. Coup d'etat is not overthrow of the state. A president that is not functioning according to the national integrity of his nation is coup d'etat and needs to be put away. But now we have been blinded by a lot of these Westerners, blinded by their deceitful words, and thinking that with the people reclaiming power to themselves is coup d'etat and it's undemocratic. It is true democracy. That is true democracy. What is happening in African nation? That is true democracy. The military is to protect the national integrity of its nation. The military does not work for a president, because a president is a person. The military works for a nation and for the good of a nation. The military is that arm that is to defend democratic principles. And if the president is going against the same democratic principles, it is the duty of the military to safeguard the national integrity of the state to take power out of that man. So coup d'etat is when a state is working against democratic principle. That is a real coup d'etat, not when people decide to take power themselves. So that we should make that very clear. That is why you see a lot of African countries they are claiming in coup d'etat, they are claiming it's undemocratic, because they want to keep, the West want to keep forcing puppet leaders into African nations to loot African resources. So through democracy, I'm really happy Africans are waking up to this call. They are seeing what is happening, and they know that it is time. We have to practice true democracy in Africa, with African values, with African integrity, with African structures, African control and dependency on African power. That is going to happen in Africa, and that is when we will really enjoy the proceeds of true democracy as other countries, some have enjoyed. Senegal is just enjoying it now. South Africa had their own time of turmoil and fight before now they set in place processes to even reflect what true democracy should look like. But I cannot say in entirety is true democracy, because if the people don't have the power to decide who governs them at very local structures, are not still democracy. If a governor can detect who becomes a chief in a village, is not democracy. If the SDOs and the DOs can influence chieftaincy in a local community, it's not democracy. So we can enjoy true democracy if the people have the power to decide their leaders right from very local levels to regional, to district levels, to regional levels, then to national level. Yes, it can be practiced in Africa with the right African mindset and the right structures being put in place.
Absolutely, with the right African mindset, Africans can actually get to where they want to be. Back to you, Chief MUSI, listen to your co-panelists. Now, getting by the definition of democracy, a rule of the people, by the people, and for the people. If we have to get by that definition, how would you recommend the African continent to actually redefine its moves for it to be able to move towards a more sustained African continent, not forgetting one with the ballot box? Chief MUSI, are you with us?
Yeah, I'm saying, thank you. I'm saying democracy is actually a system of government in which power is vested in the people or the general population of the state. And in its rightful sense, it is the rule of the majority. That's how democracy in a layman's way, or in the layman's word, should be defined. And you should also
Chief MUSI, apparently we're unable
to look at, because if you are looking at democracy and not, if we are not looking at the characteristics of democracy, it means we are missing on the point. So I would like that in order to answer your question and to see how democracy has an influence or how it can reshape African democracy without forgetting the ballot box, I would like us to actually see if we actually respect the characteristics of democracy, because one of the things which we are failing at each time without identifying is the point that we need to be able to identify to see if we are respecting what that democracy we are talking about, the rule of majority, if we are respecting its norms, because that's where we're failing as Africans. And one of the first characteristics is the elected representative. Do we have elected representatives in Africa? The answer here is obviously no. We don't have elected representatives because I speak for myself, I speak for my country, and I speak for my nation. You know very well recently we have crisis in the northwest and the southwest regions of Cameroon. And the ongoing crisis needed dialogue from both parties, from the government and from the opposing camp. But for over 7 years, this crisis has been going on. And because this crisis has been going on, elections have been taking place in Cameroon. And do you really think that the people who represent these people in these regions where the war is, where we have war, in the northwest and the southwest region, do you think the representatives are rightfully elected? Because we know very well that in any of these systems, most of the communities where we have war, they are advocating for peace and negotiation. So, as I can tell you without doubts that elections, if it's taking place in regions like this that is being catered for or is being governed by the gun, is being governed by the arms, by the gun, to say the least, and then it is difficult to say we are respecting principles of democracy. Our elected officials are not a representation of the people, because even on the days of elections, we are having places are being shut down. The second aspect of characteristic of democracy is citizen freedom. Do we, citizens of our nation, have the freedom to exercise our rights and have the right to exercise, to benefit from the results of our freedom to vote? Because at the end of the day, when we post our election, when we vote, the results are always contrary to what we voted. Do the citizens have their freedom? That's a question that everyone has to answer. This drives us towards believing that if African democracy has to come to its fusion, we have to respect the characteristics of democracy. The third one is an independent judicial system. You cannot have a judicial system that proclaims elections in a country and that judicial system is not independent. How can a ruling government be the ones nominating persons who pronounce election results? How does that happen? Where does that happen in the world? What if they lose the elections? The only few countries like Kenya that we recently saw, or like Senegal, the reason is the institutions that were put in place were independent, they were free, and they were fair. That's why you started seeing the practice of democracy. And I would just go a little bit further to say that one of the best democracies in Africa, the three best countries in Africa that has the best democracies are Cape Verde. It's Cape Verde. We have Seychelles, and I think South Africa. These are the three countries in Africa that has the best democracies. But a country like Cape Verde and Seychelles, they are little tiny countries at the side down the islands. So they are little countries down with little less than no population, up to 4 million. And maybe, like we said, we should go back to our traditional practices. This country maybe have a population that can easily be controlled, governed, and they still believe in the ideologies of their ancestors. And now let me talk. The fourth principle or characteristic of democracy is an organized opposition system. You cannot practice democracy when the opposition is not organized, when the opposition is not in unison, when the opposition is not speaking one language. That is some of the loopholes that the government of Cameroon has used over our opposition parties. So opposition parties within a system of democracy have to practice and believe in their ideologies as an opposition, because you are opposing a system. You are not opposing yourselves. And if you are opposing a system, all of you as opposition needs to have the same ideologies, the same direction, and the same perspective in opposing this governance, the system of governance that's in place. And then you put in place another system, and whatever differences or contributions that you have as oppositions, all of you come on the table, sit as an institution, and implement them within the government that you would win as an opposing government. So our opposition leaders need to be organized as one. And the last characteristic of democracy, which I'll mention, is having a democratic society committed to the values of tolerance, cooperation, and compromise. If we have to practice democracy, we need to have the ability to tolerate, we need to have the ability to cooperate, and we need to have the ability to compromise where we think that we have shortcomings. If you are going into an election and you think you have a minority followership, you should be able to compromise it, cooperate with another person so that you have a more bigger structure to be able to face the bigger problem that's in front of you. And after having exhausted these 5 characteristics of democracy, and if we as Africans listen to these characteristics and we practice them as Africans, we are now going towards an African democracy where the ballot box will be a more decisive factor, which I think is something we need to capitalize on. Thank you.
Thank you, Chief MUSI, for that brilliant and insightful contribution to this edition. Given we're almost at the end of today's edition of Talking Point, I'll direct this last question to you, Dr. LIVANCLIFF. You listened to your co-panelist in a bit to add up to what he had to say. Charting the way forward, could you proceed with your closing remarks?
Thank you very much, Sharon. I think His Royal Majesty well and brilliantly elaborated it, and I think this is the way forward. This is practicing democracy with the true principles of democracy. If we want the choice of the people to be reflected in the ballot box, we have to practice what His Royal Majesty has rightly said, and that is the way forward for us. And also, we as Cameroonians, as young people, have to take our position. We have to make our voice heard. We are the ones responsible to advocate for this electoral reforms, because it needs a reform. Cameroon needs an electoral reform of all the processes based on the characteristics His Royal Majesty have rightly said. We need an electoral reform, and it is us Cameroonians that can push for this reform. If we don't know, if we are not aware of how electoral process can be, if we want to rely on the failed structures that have failed before they even started, we will never go to anywhere. So what I'm calling for my fellow Cameroonians, let's unite. Let's push for an electoral reforms where the electoral processes and structures will be reformed, and where the ballot box will be the true reflection of the choice of the people and a deciding factor of what the people want. I think if we do that, then we will begin to enjoy an election in Cameroon which is free, fair, and transparent, and that reflects the wish of the people. Thank you.
Thank you, Dr. LIVANCLIFF, and that cuts across the entire continent. Just to reiterate that Cameroon, like you mentioned, will be hosting elections come 2025. That was Dr. LIVANCLIFF MBIANKE, a Pan-Africanist as well as global activist, and we were equally being joined by His Royal Majesty MUSI. Thank you all for joining us and your insightful contributions to the success of today's edition.
Thank you, Sharon.
Thank you very much.
It's always a pleasure.
Thank you, Sharon. It's always a pleasure being here.
Absolutely.
Thank you, His Royal Majesty. It's a pleasure meeting you today.
Ladies and gentlemen, like you heard our panelists, it's on that note that we draw down the curtains of today's edition of the program Talking Points over your Pan-African channel for you, Media Africa. Thank you for watching, and do stay in company of our numerous programs.